The morning Inez Hale buried her father, the banker came to take the land, and she told him she would sooner set fire to every acre than sign his papers and become some rancher's convenient wife. It was the spring of 1878, in the dry and unforgiving territory of New Mexico, where the earth ran red and amber, and the sky pressed down on the land like a hand that hadn't decided yet whether it meant to bless or to smother. The town of Cobber Creek sat at the edge of a wide valley, surrounded by mesa country that cracked and baked through summer and froze its shallow creeks in January. And it was a place where survival was not a given, but an argument you had to make fresh every single day. Inez was 24 years old. With dark hair she kept braided back and hands already roughened from working soil beside her father since she was old enough to hold a hoe. Her mother had died of fever when Inez was 11, and after that, it had been just the two of them, her and Gideon Hale, working their 40-acre plot at the eastern edge of the valley. They grew corn and beans and kept a small kitchen garden. They traded eggs from their 6 hens. They lived carefully and quietly, and when the drought hit in 1876, they borrowed money from Donahue and Sons, the only lending house in Cobber Creek. Gideon Hale died in March of 1878, taken by a lung sickness that had been building in him for 2 winters, and finally claimed him on a cold, clear morning when the cottonwoods were just beginning to show their first green. He went peacefully in his bed with Inez holding his hand, and he said to her in the last clear moment he had that the land was hers, that it had always been meant for her hands more than his, and that she should not let anyone take it from her. She had said she wouldn't. She had meant it. The debt to Donahue and Sons sat at $140, which in that year was not a small sum for a woman working 40 acres alone. Inez had managed 40 of it herself, doing laundry for 3 families in town and selling vegetables through the previous autumn. But the remaining $100 had a due date on it that came 6 weeks after her father's funeral, and when that date arrived and she could not meet it, a man named Clifton Donahue rode out to the Hale property in his good jacket and his good hat and informed Inez that the land would need to be surrendered or the debt restructured. The restructuring he proposed was not financial, it was marital. His son, Harlan Donahue, was 29 and in need of a wife, and the land could stay in her possession as part of the Donahue family holdings if she agreed to marry him. Inez had looked at Clifton Donahue standing on her porch, in the shadow of the same doorframe her father had stood in 1,000 mornings, and she had felt something very cold and very clear move through her chest. "I would rather work this land alone until my back gives out," she told him, "than marry into your family for shelter. This is my land and my debt, and I will settle it on my own terms." Clifton Donahue had smiled the kind of smile that meant he thought she didn't understand her situation. He told her she had 2 weeks to reconsider. He left without rushing, which she understood was its own kind of threat. That evening, Inez sat at the kitchen table her father had built from juniper wood, and she did the arithmetic again, because arithmetic didn't change, but sometimes the act of doing it again helped her think. The numbers were the same. She needed $100 in 2 weeks. She had $11 in the coffee tin above the stove. She had a mule named Gerald, 3 horses her father had been boarding for a man in town who owed the debt of their keep, some tools, and 40 acres of land that was beginning to wake up from winter. She was still sitting at that table when, 3 mornings later, a wagon rolled down the road that passed her property, slowed, and stopped. Warren Sullivan had been traveling through New Mexico for 6 days when he stopped at the Hale property, and he had not planned to stop there at all. He was 30 years old, broad-shouldered, with a quiet face that people often mistook for coldness until he smiled, which softened everything. He had grown up in Kansas, worked cattle drives through his early 20s, and then spent several years in Colorado learning land, learning soil, learning what the country could yield if you worked it patiently and with your whole attention. He had come south through New Mexico looking for land to buy, and had $300 in a leather satchel under the wagon seat that represented everything he owned, and intended to invest in a future that was his own rather than borrowed from someone else's dream. His horse had thrown a shoe somewhere around midday. The shoe had not come off clean, and the horse was favoring her left foreleg, and Warren had walked her the last mile rather than push her. And when he saw the Hale property, he saw the small barn at its edge, and a woman carrying water from the pump to a garden bed, and he pulled the wagon to a stop and called out asking if she had a farrier's tools or knew where he could find one. Inez looked up from her watering. She studied the man and the wagon and the limping horse with the calm, assessing gaze she turned on most things. She was not afraid of strangers on the road, though she was careful with them. She had been raised in the West, and she knew the difference between a man who was trouble and a man who needed help, and this man had the look of the latter. "I've got my father's tools in the barn," she said. "I can take a look if you want." She was not a trained farrier, but she had learned shoeing from her father the way she had learned most practical things, by watching and then doing, and she had shod their horses more than once. She set down her water pail and walked to the road, and Warren Sullivan tipped his hat and introduced himself, and she told him her name, and that was the beginning. She examined the horse's hoof, a mare named Clara, and found that the shoe had come off clean after all with no damage to the hoof wall. She had a shoe in the barn that was close enough in size, and she heated it in the small forge her father had kept for general ironwork, and shaped it to fit and nailed it on with a steadiness that Warren watched without speaking, because there was something about the quality of her concentration that felt like it deserved silence. When it was done, Warren walked Clara in a slow circle and the horse moved evenly and well. "What do I owe you?" he asked. "Nothing," Inez said. "It's a small thing." It wasn't small to Clara, Warren said, and the mare turned her head toward him as if agreeing, and Inez almost smiled. He could see that she was tired. Not the ordinary tired of a morning's work, but something deeper, the kind of tired that accumulates over weeks of carrying worry alone. He didn't say anything about it because it wasn't his place, but he noticed it, the way he noticed most things about landscape and living creatures, which was carefully and without judgment. "I've got food if you want to rest your horse for an hour," Inez said, because that was how she had been raised, which was to offer what she had even when what she had was limited. Warren accepted, and they sat on the porch with cold cornbread and water, and he told her he was looking for land in the valley, and she told him about the valley with the knowledge of someone who had grown up in it, where the water table was reliable, and where it wasn't, which sections flooded in the wet years and which dried first in the dry years. And he listened to her with the full quality of attention that she was not accustomed to receiving from anyone. After a while, he asked how her own land sat in relation to those patterns. "Well enough," she said. "The eastern ridge catches the morning water and the soil holds it. My father chose this plot for that reason. You can grow a great deal on 40 acres if the soil is right and you're willing to work." "Sounds like you know it well," he said. "I've worked it my whole life," she said, and something in the way she said it told him there was a story attached to those words that went beyond simple biographical fact. He didn't push. But as he was hitching Clara back to the wagon and preparing to leave, he asked, in the casual tone of someone not trying to seem like they're asking, whether there was any land for sale in the valley that she knew of. Inez was quiet for a moment. Then she said, and she did not entirely know why she said it, perhaps because she was tired or because something in this man's quiet attention had made her feel, for the first time in weeks, that she was being treated as a person rather than a piece of a transaction. "There might be 40 acres available here inside 2 weeks if things don't go differently than they're currently going." Warren looked at her. "Yours. Temporarily still mine," she said. "I have a debt I can't meet and a banker trying to use it to make me his son's wife, and I've told him no and I intend to keep telling him no, but the arithmetic is the arithmetic." She hadn't planned to say all of that. The words had come out in a rush, And then she stood there in the afternoon sun feeling slightly exposed, the way you feel when you've said something truer than you intended. Warren Sullivan did not look at her with pity. He looked at her with the same kind of calm assessment she had turned on him when he first came down the road. He set one hand on the side of the wagon and was quiet for a moment that felt thoughtful rather than awkward. "What's the debt?" he asked. $100, she said. "Due in 11 days, he nodded slowly. He looked out at the land, at the 40 acres stretching back from the road toward the eastern ridge, green beginning to come up where she had already turned the soil. "What if," he said, and his voice was measured and serious, "someone bought into the debt, not the land, the debt, and you paid them back through the harvest?" Inez looked at him with a directness that was characteristic of her. "That sounds like a different version of the same problem," she said. "I don't trade one obligation for another without understanding what's being bought." "That's fair," Warren said. "What if nothing was being bought? What if it was a business arrangement between people who both want the same outcome, which is that the land stays worked and the debt gets settled and nobody gets forced into a marriage they don't want?" She studied him. He met her gaze without flinching, without the particular kind of calculation she had learned to recognize in men who wanted things from her. "You don't know me," she said. "You stopped here 3 hours ago because your horse threw a shoe." "That's true," he said. "So why would you do that?" He was quiet again, in that thoughtful way. Then he said, "Because what you described is wrong and I've got $100 I wasn't planning to spend for another 2 weeks anyway. And the valley sounds like the kind of place I could build something. And if you're willing to talk about it plainly and honestly, then I think we could find an arrangement that works for both of us without anyone losing what they shouldn't have to lose." Inez Hale had not survived 24 years in New Mexico by being naive or by trusting quickly. But she had also not survived by being foolish. And there was a difference between trusting a stranger because you were desperate and trusting a stranger because the evidence in front of you suggested he was worthy of a degree of consideration. She had watched him shoe the horse with patience. She had watched him eat cornbread without taking more than his share. She had watched him listen to her talk about soil and water tables with the interest of someone who genuinely wanted to know, and all of those small things added up to something in the accounting she kept of people. "Come back tomorrow morning," she said. "We'll talk plainly." He came back. He came back with a notepad and a pen, and he sat at the juniper table in her kitchen, and they talked for 2 hours about the land and the debt and the harvest, and what a reasonable repayment looked like, and what each of them needed from any arrangement they made. He was precise without being cold about it, and he was honest about what he had, which was $300, some experience in land and cattle, no family obligations, and a genuine desire to settle somewhere and build something that would last. By the end of that morning, they had an agreement that was written down and signed by both of them. Warren would pay Donahue and Sons the $100 owed by Gideon Hale's estate. In return, Inez would grant him a partial interest in the property at a fair market value to be determined by the harvest yield of the following season, with the option to formalize the partnership at that time or dissolve it if either party found the arrangement unworkable. The land remained in Inez's name. She kept full decision-making authority over the farm. He invested and she produced, and they would revisit the terms after harvest. She had written her own clause into the agreement, which was that no personal obligation of any kind was implied or assumed by either party beyond those stated in the document, and that the arrangement was a business one in its entirety. She had written it clearly and without apology, and Warren had read it and signed it without comment, and that had told her something about him too. They rode into town together that afternoon in his wagon. Inez sat straight-backed on the seat beside him, wearing her father's coat because the spring afternoons could still carry a bite to them, and Warren drove Clara with an easy hand on the reins, and they didn't talk much on the way, but the silence between them was the comfortable kind rather than the strained kind, which Inez noted. At Donahue and Sons, Clifton Donahue looked at the two of them walking through his door with an expression that moved from surprise to something calculating, and then settled into a kind of cold displeasure. Warren paid the $100 in clean bills, and Inez stood beside him and watched Clifton Donahue's face with a steadiness that was better than any speech she could have made. Clifton looked between them. "I see you found yourself a different solution," he said to Inez. "I found a business partner," Inez said. "We'll be taking a receipt for this payment." They walked out of Donahue and Sons into the spring afternoon with the receipt in Inez's hand, and Warren squinted into the sun and said, in a perfectly neutral tone, "He didn't seem happy." "No," Inez agreed. "Will he cause trouble?" Inez considered this honestly. "Clifton Donahue causes trouble for people who seem like they can be affected by it," she said. "I don't intend to be affected by it." Warren glanced at her with something in his expression that was close to admiration. "All right then," he said. The weeks that followed were the busiest of Inez's life, which was saying something. Spring planting on 40 acres was not a quiet enterprise, and doing it alongside another person after years of doing it with only her father required a constant renegotiation of rhythm and method. Warren worked hard, which she had expected from what she'd seen of him, but he also worked intelligently, which she had hoped for but wasn't certain of. He didn't assume he knew better than she did about her own land. When he had an idea, he said so and gave his reasoning, and then listened to hers, and they came to conclusions together that were usually better than what either of them would have arrived at alone. He had brought a tent and set it at the edge of the property near the barn, not presuming to occupy the house, which Inez appreciated and also privately found somewhat touching. The house was small, just 2 rooms, her father's room and her own, and the kitchen area off the main room, and she had not offered him a place to sleep inside, and he had not asked for one. They fell into a routine that began at first light and ended when the sky went dark, and they ate dinner together most evenings because it was practical, and because the food was better when there were 2 people to cook it and share it. And in the evenings, after eating, they would sometimes sit on the porch in the cooling air and talk. This was where Inez began to know Warren Sullivan as a person rather than a transaction. He talked about Kansas, about the flat, enormous sky and his mother's garden and his father who had been a difficult man, but had taught him to work honestly. He talked about the cattle drives through his early 20s, the sheer physical weight of moving animals across hundreds of miles of open country, the way time moved differently out on the trail, elongated and strange. He talked about Colorado, about learning soil, about a farmer there named Augusto who had taught him that the land was not something you conquered, but something you entered into a conversation with, and that the ones who listened to it did better over time than the ones who tried to dominate it. Inez listened and offered her own stories in return, carefully at first and then more freely. She talked about her mother, how she still sometimes expected to smell coffee brewing at certain times of morning, the way her mother had always brewed it. She talked about her father's particular genius with corn, the way he had figured out the exact combination of soil amendment and planting depth that produced results none of the other farms in the valley could match, and how she had learned every piece of it from him over years of watching and working alongside him. She talked about being a woman working land in Cobber Creek, which was not a comfortable thing to be, though she said it in a matter-of-fact way rather than a bitter one. The men in town were not openly hostile mostly, but they operated on assumptions that she had to push against constantly, assumptions that she would make mistakes or couldn't manage something physical or needed a man to sign her name on things for her. She had pushed against those assumptions steadily for years, and most of the time she didn't think much about it. But sometimes the weight of the constant pushing was something she noticed, the way you notice a stone in your shoe that you've been walking on so long you've almost stopped feeling it. Warren listened to this without the discomfort she sometimes saw in men when she spoke plainly about the world. He didn't try to tell her she was wrong about how it was, and he didn't offer reassurances that didn't mean anything. He just listened, and once he said quietly, That's a hard way to live, constantly proving something that shouldn't need proving. She looked at him in the evening light and said, "It's the way it is." "For now," he said, and the simple stubbornness of that phrase surprised her into something that was almost a laugh. He was funny sometimes, in a dry, understated way that she appreciated because it matched her own sense of humor, which was also dry and understated. He made observations about things with a deadpan quality that often caught her off guard, and she had discovered fairly early that her stoic public face had very little defense against his particular brand of quiet wit, which both pleased and slightly alarmed her. She was beginning to like him, more than she had intended to when she had written the personal obligations clause into their agreement. She acknowledged this to herself with the same honest practicality she brought to everything else in her life, which was, yes, this is a thing that is happening, and you should decide what you think about it. The decision she came to was that liking a person was not the same as being vulnerable to them, and that she could allow herself to enjoy his company and his conversation without that meaning anything that she hadn't agreed to. She kept herself balanced. She was careful. Warren, for his part, was working very hard not to overstep anything. He had known, fairly early on, that Inez Hale was one of the most remarkable people he had encountered, and he had encountered enough people in his 30 years to have a reasonable sample size for that judgment. She was sharp and capable and honest in a way that made most other people feel approximate by comparison. She was funny without trying to be, and kind in the practical rather than performative way, the kind that expressed itself in doing things rather than saying things. She was also deeply stubborn, which he recognized because he was also deeply stubborn, and he thought that two stubbornnesses in the same space either destroyed each other or complemented each other, and in their case it seemed to be the latter. He had signed a document specifically stating that no personal obligation was implied. He had done so genuinely, meaning it as she had meant it, which was as a protection for both of them. He was aware that protection had a funny way of becoming a cage if you weren't careful about what you were protecting. He was also aware that he didn't have any right to feelings about a woman he had known for 3 weeks, regardless of how those feelings were developing, and he kept them mostly to himself. Mostly. One evening in mid-May, after a long day of fencing the north section of the property where the soil was softest and most in need of windbreak, they were sitting on the porch eating beans and bread, and the sun was going down in that particular New Mexico way, where the whole sky turns colors that seem too extravagant to be real, deep orange and rose, and a strange luminous purple at the edges. And Inez was watching it the way she always watched the sunset, like it was something she was cataloging. "My father said this valley had the best sunsets in the whole territory," she said. "He'd been far enough around to have an opinion on it." "He was right," Warren said. She glanced at him. He was watching the sky too, and the light was doing something to his face that made him look less guarded than usual, more open, and she thought that he had a good face, a face that expressed things even when he wasn't trying to express them. "Why New Mexico?" she asked. "You could have gone to Texas or Arizona." "Texas has too many people with the same idea," he said. "Arizona's beautiful, but the water's worse. And someone described this valley to me in a bar in Santa Fe 2 years ago, and I wrote it down and didn't forget it." "Who described it?" "A man named Ruiz who'd grown up here and left and then spent years wishing he hadn't," Warren said. "He described the soil and the light in a way that made me put it on a list. A list of places to investigate. A list of places worth going to," he said, and then he looked at her and added, "He was right about those too." Inez looked back at the sunset and did not let herself react to that in the way that some portion of her wanted to. But she thought about it later, lying in bed in her father's old room that she had started sleeping in because it was slightly larger and had a window that faced east, and she thought about it with an honesty that she extended to very few things. In June, the corn came up in long green rows along the eastern section, and Inez stood at the edge of the field and felt something that was almost like joy, a little fierce and private. She had planted it using her father's exact method, the soil amendment and the depth and spacing that he had refined over 30 years, and seeing it come up the way it should was like hearing his voice saying she had listened properly. Warren stood beside her and was quiet for a moment, looking at the field, and then he said, "That's something." "It is," she said. "Your father would be pleased." She didn't answer that immediately because the truth was she thought he would be, and that the thought produced a tightness in her chest that she was still learning to live around. But after a moment she said, "Yes, he would have been proud of this field," and then, surprising herself, she said, "He would have liked you." Warren looked at her. She felt the look but kept her eyes on the corn. "That means something to me," he said simply. She nodded once and then said they'd better check the irrigation channel before it got too late in the morning, and they went to do that, and neither of them said anything more about it. But the words remained in the air between them like something that had taken root. The first real trouble came in July. It came in the form of Harlan Donahue, who was indeed 29, and who had apparently not gotten the message that the situation had been resolved in March. Harlan was a broad man who had his father's calculating quality, but less of his father's self-control, and he had been drinking when he rode out to the Hale property on a Tuesday afternoon, the heat sitting like a physical weight on the valley. Inez was alone in the yard, Warren having driven into town for supplies. Harlan Donahue tied his horse to the fence post and walked up to the porch with the unsteady deliberateness of a man who has had enough whiskey to make him think he's perfectly clear-headed. "Inez Hale," he said, "I hear you've got some Kansas drifter working your land." "I hear you've got no business being here," Inez said. She did not stand up from the porch steps where she was sorting seed. She did not alter her posture or her expression. "My family was good to you," Harlan said, "and you threw it back at us." "Your family offered me a debt for marriage trade, which is not goodness," Inez said. "I declined. The debt was paid. There's no remaining matter between your family and mine." Harlan stepped up onto the porch. Inez stood up at that point because there was a difference between not flinching and being careless, and he was close now and smelled of whiskey and resentment. "You think that stranger's going to stay," Harlan said. "You think he's not going to take what he wants and move on and leave you with nothing." "I think that's not your concern," Inez said, "and I'd like you to step off my porch." Harlan looked at her with a kind of angry bewilderment, like a man who had expected something different and was encountering the reality of the situation for the first time. He was not a truly dangerous man, Inez thought, but he was drunk and humiliated, and that was its own category of difficult. The sound of the wagon on the road made him turn. Warren drove Clara up to the gate and stepped down from the wagon with groceries and took in the scene on the porch in a single assessing glance. He walked to the porch with a calm, unhurried gait and set the grocery box down and looked at Harlan Donahue. "Can I help you with something?" he asked, in a tone that was entirely pleasant and entirely unmoved. Harlan looked between them. Something in Warren's stillness, which was the stillness of a man who had moved cattle across hundreds of miles and learned to stay calm in situations that required calm, clearly communicated itself to Harlan even through the whiskey. "This isn't done," Harlan said, mostly to Inez. "It's done," she said. Harlan untied his horse and left, and when he was down the road and out of sight, Warren turned to Inez and she saw that his jaw was set in a way she hadn't seen before. "Did he touch you?" he asked. "No," she said. "He stepped on my porch uninvited, nothing more." Warren exhaled. He picked up the grocery box. "I should have been here," he said. "I handled it," Inez said. "I know you did," he said, and there was nothing condescending in it. "I just would have rather been here." And then, more quietly, as he went inside with the groceries, "I'll be here from now on." She stood on the porch for a moment after he went inside and acknowledged to herself that his words had landed somewhere in her chest and were resting there with a warmth she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure what to do with. Harlan Donahue came back once more, 3 weeks later in August, this time sober and with his father, and this time Warren was there. The Donahues made one last attempt to complicate the ownership question, suggesting that the original debt agreement had implications for the land title that the partial interest transaction with Warren might have muddied. Warren had anticipated this. He had, during his trip into town for supplies, spent an hour with the Territorial Land Office reviewing exactly what the title situation was and what, if any, complications could be manufactured around it. And he had come home with a very clear picture of the legal reality, which was that the land was Inez's, the debt was settled, and there was nothing the Donahues could legitimately claim. He explained this to Clifton Donahue in the same yard, where Inez's father had planted his first seeds, clearly and without heat, and Clifton Donahue listened with the expression of a man revising his assessment of a situation. He looked at Warren and then at Inez, and something in the way they stood together, close and aligned and completely united in their position, told Clifton something that he apparently decided not to argue with. The Donahues rode away and did not come back. That evening Inez sat at the juniper table and allowed herself to feel, for the first time in many months, something close to settled. The corn was coming in well. The bean crop was ahead of where it had been the previous year. The debt was gone. The land was hers. She was tired and her hands were sore, and she was sitting in her father's kitchen in the last of the summer light, and she was, she thought, doing all right. Warren came in from checking on the horses and washed his hands at the basin and looked at her and said, "You look like someone who's just put down something heavy." "I feel like that too," she said. He sat down across from her and poured water into 2 tin cups and pushed one toward her. "Harlan Donahue is going to find someone else to make his family's problem," he said. "You're past it." "We're past it," she corrected, and then caught herself, because the "we" came out more naturally than she had meant it to. Warren looked at her cup and then at her. He said, carefully and without performance, "I like the sound of that." Inez wrapped both hands around her tin cup and looked at the table and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Warren, I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead," he said. "When you paid that debt in March and we wrote the agreement, were you thinking about anything other than the business arrangement?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Honestly, always," she said. "I was thinking mostly about the business arrangement," he said. "But I was also thinking that you were the most plainly impressive person I'd met in a long time, and that the situation was wrong and I wanted to help fix it. Those two things weren't entirely separate." She looked at him. "And now?" 4 months later, he met her gaze steadily. "Now I'm thinking about the business arrangement and about the person I've been working beside every day, and those two things have become a good deal less separate than they were." She nodded slowly. She was turning this over, testing it against her own feelings and her own judgment, because she did not rush at things and she did not make decisions she hadn't thought through. "I put a clause in that agreement specifically so that neither of us would be obligated to anything personal," she said. "I know," he said. "You were right to do it. But that was to protect us from expectation," she said, "not from possibility." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the summer evening was doing its slow cooling, the air coming in through the open window carrying the smell of warm earth and the faint sweetness of the corn in the field. "That's a distinction I wasn't sure you were making," Warren said carefully. "I wasn't sure I was making it either," she said. "Until now." Warren Sullivan looked at Inez Hale across the juniper table her father had built, and he did not rush toward her or make a speech of it or do anything dramatic. He simply said, "Then I'll tell you plainly that I would very much like to know what possibility looks like, if you're willing to find out alongside me." Inez was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm going to need the arrangement between us to stay honest. I'm not interested in any version of this where things go unsaid because someone's being careful. I'd rather know something difficult than not know it." "That's how I prefer it too," he said. "And I'm not going to stop working this land," she said. "That's not negotiable, not for anyone." "I would never ask you to," he said, and he said it with such clear simplicity that she believed it the way you believe things that ring true at a level below argument. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "All right then." She didn't elaborate and he didn't ask her to, because they were both people who communicated efficiently and understood each other with a precision that didn't require additional words. That night was the first night he kissed her, which happened on the porch in the dark, very quietly, and she let it happen and kissed him back. And then they sat in their separate chairs and looked at the stars over the valley for a while before they said good night. What grew between them over the following months was not the sudden overwhelm of something that catches you by surprise, but the steady, accumulating thing that happens when two people who are well suited to each other spend time together being honest. It was made of small moments and daily ones, of hands passing tools and meals shared, and disagreements worked through, and the particular pleasure of doing difficult work alongside someone who is as committed to it as you are. He asked her opinions on things, and she gave them, and he weighed them genuinely. She asked for his thoughts on soil amendment and irrigation, and he answered with the full knowledge he had and didn't hold anything back or simplify it for her. They argued sometimes about method and about timing, and the arguments were direct and sometimes heated and always resolved, because both of them were more committed to getting it right than to being right. She began to understand over those months that what she had assumed would be the hardest part of having someone else on the land, the loss of sole authority, the need to accommodate another will, was not actually hard with him, because he had no desire to overpower her or override her. He wanted what she wanted, which was for the land to thrive, and he saw her knowledge of it as an asset to be utilized rather than a challenge to be answered. In September, the harvest came in, and it was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. The corn crop in particular produced at a rate that Inez had never seen on those 40 acres in her lifetime. The bean yield was similarly impressive. The kitchen garden had done everything she asked of it. Warren had added a section of wheat on the north parcel that had been neglected in previous years, and it came in clean and heavy. They spent 2 weeks bringing it all in, working from before sunrise to after dark, and every muscle in Inez's body ached with the good honest ache of productive labor. And when they sat down to eat dinner at the end of those long days, she was so tired she could barely hold a fork, but she felt more thoroughly herself than she had since before her father got sick. On the day they finished the harvest, Warren spread a blanket in the cornfield between 2 cleared rows, and they sat there in the warm September afternoon and ate bread and cheese and drank cool water, and Inez looked at the cleared field around her and felt, so strongly that it actually made her throat tighten, her father's presence. Not in a frightening way, in the way that people who mattered remained somehow written into the places where they lived and worked. He would be pleased, she said, mostly to herself. Warren, who was lying back on the blanket looking up at the sky, said quietly, "Tell me something he told you about this land." She thought for a moment. "He said that the land doesn't owe you anything," she said. "He said that some people work land thinking it's a contract, that if you do your part then it does its part, and then they're angry when there's drought or flood because they feel cheated. He said the land isn't a contract, it's a relationship. And like any relationship, some years it gives more than others, and you have to be in it for the whole length of it, not just the good parts." Warren was quiet, and then he said, "He was a wise man." "He was," she said. "He had very little formal schooling, but he understood things in the way that some people understand things when they've paid careful attention to the actual world for long enough." "That's the best kind of education," Warren said. She looked at him. He was still looking at the sky, and the afternoon light was on his face, and she thought that she had, in the space of 6 months, arrived at a feeling for this man that she had not expected to arrive at, and that was now too large and too real to be measured against the careful language of any agreement. She said his name. He turned his head to look at her. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I want to say it plainly so that there's no ambiguity." He sat up. He gave her his full attention, which was something he was very good at. She said, "I am in love with you." "I didn't intend for that to happen, And I don't say it to create any obligation. But I put a clause in our original agreement about not wanting personal obligations implied. And I want to honor the spirit of that clause by telling you directly what is true for me rather than keeping it to myself to be careful. Warren Sullivan looked at Inez Hale in the September light in the middle of the field they had harvested together, and he was quiet for a moment. And then he laughed, a short surprised sound that she had never quite heard from him before, and she felt a flicker of something that was close to alarm, but he was shaking his head. "I've been trying to figure out the right moment to tell you the same thing for 2 months," he said, "and you've just done it first and better than I would have." She looked at him. He looked back at her. "I love you, Inez," he said, and it was so direct and unadorned that it landed in her chest like something arriving home. "I've loved you since approximately the moment you put a shoe on my horse better than most trained farriers could manage, and then told me I didn't owe you anything for it." She felt something in her face do something it didn't do very often, which was to soften entirely, all the careful guardedness she carried just below the surface releasing like a held breath. "That was the very beginning," she said. "It was the beginning," he agreed. He reached across the blanket and took her hand, carefully and without rushing, and she let him, and they sat in the cleared field in the warm September afternoon, and Inez thought that happiness was, perhaps, a more practical thing than she had ever given it credit for. It was not the extravagant thing in the songs, not something that overtook you against your will. It was something built, day by day, out of honest work and honest conversation, and the accumulated weight of small moments that didn't seem like much individually, but that added up over time to a life that was worth having. October brought the question of the formal arrangement between them, the business one, the one they had written on paper in March. The harvest had more than satisfied the original terms, and Warren had, in the intervening months, purchased an adjacent parcel of 35 acres that had been available, so that between them they were now working 75 acres of valley land. He brought the original agreement to the juniper table one evening in mid-October with 2 cups of coffee and put it between them. "We said we'd revisit this after harvest," he said. "We did," she said. "I've been thinking about what I want to propose," he said. "So have I," she said. He looked at her. "You first." She shook her head. "You first." He looked at the document and then at her and said, "I'd like to make this permanent, both of it, all of it." He paused. "But I want to do it right, and I know what right means to you, which is that nothing gets taken or assumed and nothing exists without your full agreement." Inez wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Go on," she said. He reached into his coat and put a document on the table beside the original agreement. It was folded and she didn't open it yet. "That's the deed to the combined property," he said. 75 acres. I spoke to the land office last week. With your permission, I'd like your name on it." She looked at the folded paper. "My name on it." "Your name on it," he confirmed. "Inez Hale listed as co-owner. The land that your father built and the land I bought together. Yours as much as mine, on paper as much as in reality." She was very still. "And the personal question," she said. "I'd like to marry you," he said. "Not because it's convenient and not because it solves any problem and not as any kind of arrangement. Because I want to spend the rest of my life working alongside you and talking with you and arguing with you about soil amendments and watching you watch the sunset like you're cataloging it. And I can't think of any reason to want that and not say so." Inez looked at the folded deed and then at Warren Sullivan, at his steady face and his honest eyes and the quality of attention he gave her that she had never received from anyone else in her life in exactly this way. She had said to Clifton Donahue in the spring that she would rather work the land than marry for shelter. And she had meant it. Every word of it was true. But this was not that. This was not shelter. This was not a transaction or a convenience. This was a man who had, in the space of 7 months, become the person she most wanted to talk to at the end of a long day, the person whose opinion she valued more than almost anyone else's, the person who had taught her that having someone beside her didn't have to mean giving up any piece of herself. "You're handing me the deed," she said. "I'm handing you the deed." he said. "And then I'm asking if you'd consider sharing it with me." She reached out and picked up the folded document and opened it. The land office had done it properly. Her name was there in the official ink, first listed because he had asked them to list it that way. Inez Hale, co-owner of the combined parcel known as the Valley property east of Cobber Creek. She folded it back up and set it down. "Yes," she said. "Yes to the deed or yes to the marriage?" he asked. "Both," she said. "Obviously both." He smiled, the full smile that transformed his face, and she thought that she had not seen it enough times yet, that she would need to see it many more times before she had enough. They were married in November, in the small church in Cobber Creek, which was a plain building that the community had built together 3 years prior, and that smelled of pine and candle wax. Inez wore her mother's green dress, altered to fit her, and Warren wore a clean dark jacket that he had bought in town for the occasion. And the ceremony was performed by the circuit pastor who came through Cobber Creek every 2 months, and the witnesses were the Rays family from the neighboring property, whose matriarch, Dolores Rays, had known Inez's father and who wept happily through the whole short service. Warren said his vows to Inez in the direct, unhurried way he said everything, and when he said "I will," he said it with an emphasis that made it sound like a statement of intent rather than a compliance. And Inez said her vows with a steadiness that had nothing cold in it, only certainty. And when the pastor announced them husband and wife, Dolores Rays made a sound of pure pleasure that made several people smile. Walking out of the church into the November afternoon, Inez's hand through Warren's arm, she felt the shape of her life rearranging itself into something she hadn't known to plan for, something better than any plan she had made. That winter was the warmest she had known in several years, which in New Mexico meant only that it froze at night and not through the day, and they spent it doing the winter work of the farm, which was maintenance and preparation, repairing fences and the barn roof and planning the next year's planting. They had long evenings. They read to each other sometimes, books ordered from Santa Fe through the general store, histories and practical texts, and once a novel that Warren had picked because the description in the catalog intrigued him, and that turned out to be a somewhat lurid adventure story that made Inez laugh more than any piece of fiction had in years. They played cards with the Rays family on Friday evenings and went to the Sunday services when the circuit pastor came through, and attended the town's small social events with a comfortable regularity that established them as a settled part of the community. Inez began to understand what it meant to have a partner, not in the business sense, though that too, but in the full sense, someone who shared the weight of the difficult things and with whom the good things were better for being shared. It was not always easy. They disagreed sometimes on things that mattered, argued with real heat occasionally, and she discovered that Warren's stubbornness, which she had liked when it was pointed at Clifton Donahue, was less convenient when it was pointed at her. But the arguments resolved. They were both committed to resolution because they were both committed to the same thing, which was the life they were building together. In the spring of 1879, Inez discovered she was expecting a child. She told Warren in the kitchen on a morning in April, directly, because that was how she told him everything. She said she was fairly certain, and that she had spoken with Dolores Rays, who had more experience with such things than anyone else in Inez's acquaintance, and Dolores agreed. Warren received this news in his characteristic fashion, which was a brief, complete stillness, and then something moving through his face that was joy in its most unguarded form. He came around the table and took her hands and asked how she was feeling, and she said she was feeling fine, a little tired in the mornings, and he asked if there was anything she needed or anything she wanted to change about how they were working, and she told him she would tell him when things needed changing and not before, and he said all right, and then he held her for a long moment in the kitchen doorway, and she let herself rest against him with a complete lack of resistance that was, for her, a significant thing. The pregnancy was straightforward, as these things could be, and Inez worked the land through the summer with adjustments as needed, because she was not going to stop being who she was because she was carrying a child, and Warren supported this without patronizing her about it. He did take on more of the heavier labor without being asked, which she noticed and appreciated, and they had one argument about it in June when he tried to take over a fencing task she was perfectly capable of managing, and she told him clearly that she would decide what she could manage, and he acknowledged this and apologized, and they moved on. Their son was born in December of 1879, on a cold, clear morning very like the morning her father had died, which Inez took as the universe making a kind of exchange that was not ungenerous. The birth was attended by Dolores Reyes and the town's doctor, who arrived slightly after the process was already significantly advanced. They named him Gideon Warren Sullivan, for her father first and then his, which was Inez's idea, and which made Warren look at her with an expression so full of feeling that she had to look away briefly. Gideon Sullivan arrived in the world with a considerable amount of noise and a full head of dark hair, and the look of a person who had opinions about things from the very first moment, which Inez recognized as entirely appropriate. Warren held his son for the first time in the gray December morning with the kind of careful amazement that large, steady men display when they are holding something small and new, and Inez watched him from the bed and felt the full shape of her life in that moment, its depth and its richness, and the extraordinary distance between where she had been in March of 1878 and where she was now. Gideon was a healthy child and grew steadily and enthusiastically through the following year. He had Warren's steadiness and Inez's focus, which combined in him into a particular quality of determined calm that was his own. He was a boy who watched things carefully before engaging with them, and then engaged with them completely, which both his parents recognized. The farm expanded in 1880. Warren's 35 acres had been producing well, and they added a small herd of cattle, 8 head, which was enough to have beef for themselves, and to sell a few animals per year, and which filled out the farm's operations in a way that made the whole enterprise more stable. They hired a young man from town named Pedro Escobedo, who was 17 and energetic, and who had a gift with animals that Warren recognized immediately, and Pedro became a regular and valued part of the operation. Pedro was from one of the older families of New Mexico, families who had been in the territory generations longer than most of the Anglo settlers, and who understood the land in a way that was embedded in their relationship to it across time. Inez had always had respect and warmth toward the Mexican and Mestizo families of the valley, friendships built through years of neighborly trading and community events, and Pedro's presence on the farm deepened those ties in ways that enriched the life of the whole property. Inez thought sometimes about the injustice of the way the territory had been organized, the way land that had been home to people for generations had passed by legal mechanism into other hands, the way the law was not always the same law for everyone depending on what your name was and where you had come from. She did not pretend this was not happening, and she extended the fairness she wanted for herself to her dealings with everyone around her, which was not nothing, even if it was not enough to address the full scale of what was wrong. Dolores Reyes said to her once, in the comfortable directness of their friendship, that Inez had more sense about what was right and fair than most people with her particular advantages, and that this was not a flattery but an observation. Inez had taken it as an obligation rather than a compliment. In 1881, Cobber Creek had grown. A rail connection to the north had brought new settlers and new commerce, and the town had added a second general store and a proper school, and a doctor who had chosen to stay rather than just pass through. The Hale Sullivan Farm, as people had started calling it, was one of the most productive operations in the valley, known particularly for the corn, which Inez had continued to develop using her father's methods and her own careful observation, producing yields that other farmers in the region asked about with the particular kind of envy that manifests as sincere curiosity. Inez had begun, that year, to share her father's methods formally. She organized a small group of neighboring farmers for what was effectively a knowledge-sharing arrangement, where they came to the farm, and she demonstrated the soil amendment process and the planting approach, and answered questions with a patience that came from genuinely wanting them to succeed. Warren had encouraged this, with characteristic directness. He had said that the valley would be stronger if all its farms were more productive, and that the goodwill it built was an investment as real as any financial one. She had looked at him when he said that and said, "You're a good man, Warren Sullivan." He had said, "You've mentioned that before." "I like to mention it when it's true," she said. He'd shaken his head in the slightly amused, slightly moved way he had when she said something that landed on him, and gone back to what he was doing. The second child came in the spring of 1882, a daughter this time, who arrived in April with the wild flowers, dark-eyed and serious-faced, and who they named Rosa, for the month and for Dolores Reyes, who had been present at both births and who was, Inez had said to Warren, the closest thing to an abuela that their children would have, and Warren had agreed and gone to tell Dolores, who had been so moved she fed them dinner for a week. Rosa Sullivan grew up to be the kind of child who cataloged everything, who would stand at the edge of the cornfield the way her mother did and look at it with the expression of someone taking inventory, and who asked questions in complete sentences from a very early age. Gideon, who was 2.5 when she was born, approached his sister with the same careful observation he applied to all new things, and then decided she was acceptable and remained her devoted older brother for the rest of his life. Warren taught Gideon to ride when the boy was 4, on the oldest and gentlest horse they had, and Gideon took to it with a gravity and a pleasure that made Inez watch from the fence with a happiness so full it was almost aching. She watched Warren with their son, his patience and his care, the way he taught by showing and then by stepping back and letting the child try, the way he praised specifically and honestly rather than extravagantly and emptily. And she thought that this was the man she had written a personal obligations clause to protect herself from, and she was glad, deeply glad, that the clause had done its job, which was not to prevent anything but to ensure that whatever happened would be built on choice and honesty rather than circumstance and desperation. The summer of 1883 brought a drought to the territory, the worst in a decade, and the valley felt it. The corn was the most vulnerable, and Inez watched the sky every day with the particular attention of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. They had irrigation systems they had built over the years, and those systems were the difference between surviving the drought and not. Inez had designed most of the irrigation layout herself, drawing on what her father had taught her, and on what she had learned over years of paying careful attention to how water moved through the land. Other farms in the valley struggled. 2 families to the west of them lost most of their crop. Inez shared water from the Hale-Sullivan irrigation channels with both families without charge, and organized the knowledge-sharing group to address the drought together. And Pedro Escobedo was essential in this, driving between properties and helping implement the adaptations across the valley, with an energy and competence that confirmed that hiring him had been one of the better decisions they had made. Warren managed the cattle through the drought with the experience and steadiness that characterized everything he did, finding supplemental grazing on the northern sections that retained more moisture, and keeping the herd in better condition than the drought had any right to permit. By the end of the summer, the herd was intact and the corn, though reduced, had survived, and the farm had come through the drought with its fundamentals whole. They were sitting on the porch on the first cool evening of September when the drought broke, when the sky finally delivered on the promise it had been withholding for months, and the rain came down on the valley in the best way, steadily and soaking, not the violent burst that would damage but the gentle, persistent fall that the earth could absorb. Inez stood up from her porch chair and walked to the edge of the porch and put her hand out into the rain. And she thought of her father saying that the land was a relationship and not a contract, and that you had to be in it for the whole length of it, the difficult parts as much as the good ones. Warren came and stood beside her, and they watched the rain fall on the corn and the beans and the wheat and the kitchen garden and the cattle pasture. And he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and the rain fell, and the valley breathed. Inside the house, Gideon and Rosa were asleep in the room off the kitchen that they shared, their respective dark heads on their respective pillows, and the farm was whole and the land was good, and the rain was falling, and Inez thought that she had made, in her life, one truly extraordinary decision. And it was the one she had made on the porch of this house, when a man with a limping horse had stopped on the road, and she had decided to go and see what she could do. In 1884, Pedro Escobedo, who was 20 and had been part of the farm for 4 years, and who had grown into a genuinely skilled young man, told Warren and Inez that he had saved enough money to buy a small parcel of land to the north of their property, and that he intended to start his own operation. He said this with a combination of pride and anxiety, as though he wasn't sure how they would take it. Inez told him that was the best news she'd heard in a month and asked what he needed. Warren told him that they would buy his first season's cattle from him at a guaranteed fair price, so that he had a known market for his initial production. And Pedro had looked at them both with an expression that contained a great deal of what people don't say because they don't know the words for it. Pedro Escobedo's farm to the north became a neighboring operation that shared equipment and knowledge and labor during heavy seasons, and that expanded the effective reach of the valley's agricultural community in ways that Inez found deeply satisfying, because she had not forgotten what it was to need help and to find it offered without conditions. Harlan Donahue had, in the intervening years, married a woman from Socorro who was reported to be quite capable, and who had apparently managed to establish their household on firmer footing than the Donahue family inclinations alone would have produced. Clifton Donahue had died in 1881, and the lending business had passed to Harlan, who by all accounts ran it with considerably less appetite for the kind of manipulation his father had preferred. Inez bore no particular grudge. She had what she had built, and it was enough. In the autumn of 1884, they added another room to the house, the first expansion since Inez's father had built it. Warren and Pedro built it together over 3 weekends in October, a proper room off the east side with 2 windows that faced the field, and Inez had stood back and looked at the expanded house with the same feeling she got looking at the expanded crops, the feeling of growth that was genuine and earned rather than assumed. She was 30 years old that autumn, and she thought that 30 years old with this life was something her 24-year-old self could not have imagined, not because the 24-year-old self had lacked imagination, but because some things are beyond imagination until you've lived them. One evening in October, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, she and Warren sat at the juniper table, the same table her father had built, the same table where they had written their first agreement, the same table where he had put down the deed with her name on it, and they drank coffee and talked about what the next year would look like. They talked about expanding the wheat section and trying a new soil amendment approach in the southern corn rows, and whether to increase the herd by 4 or 6 head. They talked about Gideon starting at the new school in town in the spring, and whether Rosa, who would be 2.5, was going to be the kind of child who followed her brother everywhere, which based on available evidence she absolutely was. And then the talk wound down in the easy way it wound down after long good days, and they were quiet together in the kitchen, and the lamp on the table threw a warm light over everything, over the worn surface of the juniper wood and the 2 coffee cups and Warren's work-roughened hands around his cup, and the small row of seeds Inez had been sorting earlier and left there. Warren said out of the comfortable quiet, "Do you remember what you told Clifton Donahue when he came out here with his proposition. Inez looked at him. I remember. What exactly did you tell him? Warren said with the particular quality in his voice that meant he was heading somewhere. I told him I would rather work this land alone until my back gave out than marry into his family for shelter, she said. Warren nodded slowly. And did you mean it? Every word, she said. You've still got the back, he observed. She laughed, which was a sound she had learned to let out freely in this kitchen over the years. I have. It's been reasonably cooperative so far. And the land, he said. The land is better than it's ever been, she said. And the marriage. She looked at him across the table, at this man who had stopped on her road 6 years ago with a limping horse and a clean handshake and $100 and a willingness to write things down plainly, who had worked beside her through drought and harvest and the births of their children, and the daily difficult, beautiful, ordinary work of making something real out of nothing but intention and labor. I told him I didn't want to marry for shelter, she said, and I didn't. I married for something else entirely. What? He asked, though she suspected he knew. For someone who would hand me the deed, she said, and trust me to know what to do with it. Warren Sullivan smiled at his wife across the juniper table and reached out and took her hand, and she let her fingers close around his. And outside the valley was dark and star-filled, and the corn was harvested, and the cattle were settled, and their children were asleep, and the land was theirs together, fully and honestly theirs, the way everything between them had always been. They added 3 more seasons to the farm before they sat down and looked at what they had built and agreed it was enough for now. Not enough to stop, because neither of them was built to stop, but enough to be able to look at the whole of it and see something finished in its essential shape. 75 acres, productive and well-managed, with an irrigation system that had carried them through drought and would carry them through the next one. A small herd of 20 cattle. A corn variety that had Gideon Hale's name quietly attached to it in Inez's notebooks. A specific strain refined over years of patient observation that produced reliably well on this valley's particular soil. A house with 4 rooms. A barn that was tight and weatherproof. A boy who could ride and do arithmetic, and who had his mother's eyes and his father's steadiness. A daughter who would sit in the cornfield and sort seeds with the focused pleasure of someone who had found exactly the thing they were meant to do. The valley had grown around them, Cobber Creek filling out to something that could properly be called a town, with its school and its doctor and its church and its 2 general stores, and the rail connection that had brought mail more regularly, and newspapers from back east, and all the complications and opportunities that came with the world pressing closer. The spring of 1885 was warm and early, and the planting went better than any Inez could remember. She worked the south field on a morning in April, with Rosa toddling behind her dropping seeds in the holes, with a concentration that was deeply serious for a 3-year-old. And Gideon was helping Warren with the irrigation channel on the far side, and the valley was green and warm, and the sky was the particular deep blue that appeared only in the mornings of early spring. Inez stopped at the end of a row and looked at the field stretching ahead of her, and at the small dark-haired child squatting over a seed hole with intense focus, and at the far side of the property where Warren's broad shoulders were visible over the ridge of the channel he was working on. She thought about what her father had said. The land is not a contract, it is a relationship. You have to be in it for the whole length of it. She thought that this was true of love as well, and of all the things worth building, and that the common thread between all of them was that you had to choose them not once but continuously, every day, in the small ordinary moments that added up to a life. She had chosen this. She had kept choosing it. She would keep choosing it. Rosa looked up from her seed hole and said with great satisfaction, "In." "Good," Inez said, moving to the next one. Rosa scrambled after her, seeds clutched carefully in her small fist. On the other side of the valley, Warren Sullivan was standing in the irrigation channel with his boots wet and his hat pushed back, and looking at the flow of water through the system that he and Inez had designed together over years. And he was thinking, not for the first time and not for the last time, that of all the good decisions he had made in his life. The one he had made on a spring road in New Mexico, when a woman he had never met put a shoe on his horse and told him he owed her nothing, was the one everything else had grown from. He heard Inez's voice across the field, saying something to Rosa, and then Rosa's voice in response, high and decisive, and the ordinary music of it carried in the clear morning air across the valley and was the best sound he had ever heard. He picked up his shovel and went back to work. The life they were building was not finished. It would not be finished, in the sense that living things do not finish while they are still growing, but it was real and solid and honest, and every acre of it had been earned through the kind of labor and love that leaves no doubt about what it was built for. It was built for exactly this, for the spring morning and the seeds in the ground and the child following her mother down the row and the man in the irrigation channel and the valley doing what valleys do, which is receive what you bring to it and give back what it can. Gideon Hale had said the land was a relationship. His daughter had proved it true in every direction it could be proved, and when she looked up from the south field on that April morning and saw Warren coming toward her over the ridge with Gideon running ahead of him, and when their son reached her first and she caught him and lifted him with the easy strength of someone who had been doing physical work her whole life, and when Warren arrived and touched her face with his warm, work-rough hand and smiled, she knew. With the certainty of a woman who had always preferred to know difficult things rather than not know them, that she was happy, not happy in the vague, hopeful way. Happy in the specific built and earned way, the way of people who have looked at the hardest version of their circumstances and chosen to answer it with honest work and honest love. She had said she would rather work the land than marry for shelter. She had been right. And because she had been right, because she had held that truth even when it was costly, she had eventually found both, the land and the love, not one purchased by sacrifice of the other, but each made richer by the presence of the other, the way the best things are. The deed with her name on it was in the cedar box on the shelf above the fireplace where she kept the things that mattered. She did not need to look at it. She knew exactly what it said. It said her name first, and she had earned every letter of it.